Hello, everyone, and welcome to our probably our second, if not to third to last, one of the two. We'll see how the final video goes for chapter 22. This is chapter 21, our second to last chapter for Kinesiology 406, Exercise Physiology at Concordia. And we'll see if we're going to need two more lectures for the final chapter and final thoughts on the class, or if one may do for next week. This is the last one for this week, and so I'll have one, maybe two more for next week. That's it. We'll talk more about next week and the end of this week in just a moment. So talking about cardiovascular disease and physical activity. First of all, talking a little bit about our concepts from last class for exercise prescription. The question that I posed to you, it's actually part of your project. This is kind of information that's going to be helpful for you on your project. We've talked about it before, but I'll talk about it again to make sure we have some clarity here for you. Number one question, or primary question here, how often should you train for coordination, skill, motor control, neuromuscular facilitation? They're all different ways, movement, skill, of referring to the same general idea from a very general sense. As far as how often you should train for skill, to improve skill, we're talking about every day, hopefully multiple times per day, as much time as you can to improve that skill. Being that skill specific training should really not be fatiguing. It will be at a point. There's a fatigue point for everything, but generally speaking, when we talk about training for skill, we're not talking about high loads, high speeds. That's stuff we move toward eventually. Obviously, if you're working on your golf swing, the last thing you want to try to do is to be swinging a heavy club. Why you do that for the first time, a club that's heavier with a heavier head, or why you want to swing fast. Same with why you want to put on the end of your bat a bunch of donuts on the end of your bat to be able to swing a heavier bat when you're learning the skill of hitting. You wouldn't want to do that. For skill-specific motions, we want to be slow, we want to be very controlled, and we want to do it a lot. All right, how much? As much as can be performed. From a general perspective, we're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of repetitions to see a significant difference in movement skill from a general perspective. In order for skill to be held, you have to be working on that skill on a regular basis for many years. Otherwise, you're just like relearning the game or the skill over and over and over again. I know with golf, I never did really hone it well enough that I feel like I could go out there and just hit well and score well and play a great game of golf. I have moments, but I don't have an entire good golf game. Whereas basketball, I can walk onto a court, and if I'm relatively loose and not tired, within a couple minutes, I can just shooting around practically not miss. Now, it doesn't mean that in game situations it's not the same thing, but from a skill-based perspective, I've done it so often. I've grooved that pattern over and over and over again. Myelination occurred from a very young age, and I've continued to groove that pattern over and over again to try to some extent, maintain or increase some of that myelination. Probably increasing it, point getting better than I was decades ago is unlikely, but certainly from a general process of traveling that path and a better conductive impulse to the muscle fibers, through the neurons, firing the fibers to get the right muscles to fire in the right sequence at the right time. That takes years, right? And I expect it randomly for golf, and I don't work on it as often as I should, let alone having done it for years often. That's a big difference. Time under tension, we're talking about something you should be able to do for many minutes, for 2-3+ minutes without stopping. Just go and go and go and go. It should be aerobic, right? It should be very aerobic, very light activity, nowhere near lactate threshold. So there really shouldn't be a limit in time frame, generally speaking, in working on the skill. If there is, then probably working on an aspect of the skill that's either too complex for our capacity to handle right now, or the skill itself we just haven't developed the minute joint motions before we actually develop more complex type joint actions, right? Intensity, we're talking about sub 40% force output, really, really low, probably 20% force output or less, 10-20%. Just working on a skill. Rest, why do you need rest? Unless after it's been several minutes you've been doing something. You shouldn't need much rest if you're working on a skill. Now, if we start talking about strength endurance, now we're talking about specifically a little bit more toward conditioning, not just skill-based training. Strength endurance, muscular endurance, a lot of people talk about cardiovascular endurance, which strength endurance is an aspect of cardiovascular endurance, unquestionably. However, that being said, we're talking about strength endurance, we're talking about activity-wise, it's kind of near the end of glycolytic phase of energy production, so probably at least 90 seconds or more, where it become more endurance focused, where the possibility of aerobic conditioning is more possibly more prevalent than glycolysis at about 90 seconds or longer. So strength endurance really should be sets that are 90 seconds or longer from a general perspective for time under tension or duration of sets. How often we do it could be every day for some people. If we're only doing a set of exercises, or maybe 1 or 2 sets for some people, could do every single day. More than likely, it's 48 hours between, but probably shouldn't be more than 24 to 48 hours between for how often we do it frequency-wise. Time under tension, 90 seconds or more. Intensity, we're talking about force outputs that you can maintain for at least 90 seconds to 2 minutes. So you're talking about sub 70% force outputs. Probably talking maybe 75%. You might be able to handle as much as 70-75% force output for something that's 90 seconds or longer. And again, there's always someone that may be able to handle higher force outputs than that for those time periods. There's absolutely that possibility. A well-conditioned athlete could be closer to maybe 80-85% of maximal force output, possibly. Probably pushing it, but possibly for an elite type athlete for 90 seconds or longer. And as far as rest periods, being we're more moving toward aerobic, but still at the end of glycolysis when we're talking about these kinds of things, we're probably going to need at least 30 seconds rest. Probably we shouldn't be expecting more than 45 seconds-ish, or even 60 seconds-ish is probably pushing it for that much need for rest. Otherwise, the activity we're pursuing is probably a lot more toward not so much cardiovascular system improvement, really next one, hypertrophy. But for cardiovascular system improvement, when we're talking about same kind of things as strength endurance, but now we're really talking about activities that we're looking to build your capacity to handle workloads for many, many minutes, right? Your VO2 max is 10 to 12 minutes for an athlete, whatever you can maintain force output wise for 10 to 12 minutes. How far can you get around a track, or how much distance can you cover in that amount of time, whether we're talking about the pool or in cycling, right? That said, 10 to 20 minutes time frame for the average population as well, to improve conditioning for the capacity to be able to maximally perform in those time frames. And that means to also hopefully be able to perform for longer periods than that at high intensities, let alone for a few minutes at a time, even faster than what we could do for 10 and 12 minutes, obviously. That is going to require our working on those skills for 10 minutes or more. You can get some cardiovascular benefit for just working on things for a few minutes, but you'd have to do an awful lot of sets with like 30 to 45 second breaks of aerobic type intervals, which you can do and some people do. They break it up in intervals, right? But oftentimes also I read books talking about doing a 1 minute running, 1 minute walking, 1 minute running, 1 minute walking. That's fine for someone really, really low conditioning to get you used to it. You're really not even getting much of anything right now. They're just trying to get used to slowly adapting to some level of stress. You're not going to get the real cardiovascular benefit. You're really just working on more skeletal muscle adaptation to the stress, connective tissue adaptation to the stress, not so much cardiovascular challenge. Now, if you get tired in 60 seconds, the first thing I would always say is you're probably going too fast. Slow it down. If someone says, I can't even run for 60 seconds, well, then run slower. Well, I can't pick up my feet for 60 seconds, then meaning jog, then walk. But keep lowering the intensity so you can handle it for minutes, preferably 2 or 3 minutes or more, but really pushing to 10, 20 minutes and beyond to really get cardiovascular benefit. Really need to be spending more time, 20 plus minutes per session, to really maximize or increase the probability of really truly improving your VO2 max and your cardiovascular capacity, right? Rest periods are minimal to none, as much as 30 to 45 seconds between aerobic intervals, but probably minimal to none. Very similar to strength endurance, but I even argue maybe 45 seconds is too much for cardiovascular type training, if we're really working on aerobic capacity per se, okay? Frequency is every day, possibly more than once per day, right? The intensity is quite low in this respect. You could almost call cardiovascular training in general even a lower level aspect towards of strength endurance, even though they're really very closely related, because it's still skeletal muscle adaptation. It's the primary adaptation to stress that we're entertaining for change to see improvement in actual performance. A lot of things occur over time internally when it comes to the ability to produce more force for longer periods, to increase aerobic capacity, anaerobic capacity, and all those factors, and let alone all the other independent factors of health and interdependent factors of health as well. But ultimately, skeletal muscle adaptation to stress is what we're looking for. And so when that fails, well, then we need to be taking a break. Hypertrophy, muscle fiber gain. Remember, again, generally speaking, type 1, type 2A, type 2X are 3 muscle fiber types. All of them will hypertrophy, typically more type 1 muscle fiber, predominantly, definitely type 1 muscle fiber hypertrophy when we talk about strength endurance type work and cardiovascular system improvement type work. Toward that lowest phase of strength endurance, around 90 seconds, you might be getting some more of the type 2A fibers, a little bit more of them, possibly more so than the type 1, but questionable in that regard. But when they will get size gain if you engage in that regular activity on a regular basis. The reason why hypertrophy gets such a broad range of description sometimes is because they're not always specific as to what you mean. Hypertrophy meaning maximization of body mass or mass in a given area, or just mass from a standpoint of muscle size gain, fiber growth, which is going to occur with normal activity over many weeks, right? 6 weeks at least, maybe as much as 12 weeks or more before you see a noticeable improvement in hypertrophy with regular training. And what kind of training are we talking about? Well, as far as how often, every 48 to 72 hours. If you're going to do pushing type exercises, some chest presses, horizontal adduction with elbow extension, some overhead presses, some shoulder adduction with elbow extension, and then also some we basically did essentially lateral, so frontal plane type motion. We did horizontal type plane motion. So we have to have something more in the sagittal plane. So we could still do overhead press, more sagittal plane type press. And that would accomplish the 3 basic planes of motion. And that could be up by the day right there, by the way, to be really clear. How many sets you do is dependent upon your capacity to handle stress, how often you do it, every 48 to 72 hours. We're talking about the basics for hypertrophy. If you need more than 72 hours rest, the probability is you're working at too high of an intensity, or there's something wrong in your warming up, cooling down processes. That's a predominant problem for a lot of people. Or your nutrients between sessions, rest between sessions, you're not recovering properly. That's the key factor. No one should be incapable of producing something similar from a hypertrophy standpoint, which, by the way, the work periods for time under tension, it seems to be most applicable around 40 seconds-ish to about 75 seconds. Could you go 30 seconds? Absolutely. But when you go lower in time, you're going more towards strength, less toward more neural gains, less toward actual hypertrophy growth. Okay, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, going less than that. But you want to maximize hypertrophy, you got to go a little bit longer. Now, if you go too long, well, you're going to be getting more type 1 fibers. That's why it's around 40 to 75 seconds-ish. It's pretty darn good solid range. It's not perfect by any means for time under tension for hypertrophy, but a really good one for maximization of type 2A fiber growth in particular, with some type 2X involvement, and also still some type 1 possibly. You definitely do not need to go from high reps to lower reps per set. That is really a warming up process. There's really no reason whatsoever to have people do reps 6-4-2, 8-6-4, 10-8-6, things like that. Highly unnecessary. You can absolutely do the same number for each set. Matter of fact, that's a higher volume of training potentially, which is really the overall goal, because volume is the biggest factor in increasing hypertrophy in the long term. It doesn't mean that the methods are wrong. Remember I mentioned before, the reason we're saying time under tension and not reps, not repetitions. No, I've said it before. You will make your own decisions as you go out there and train people as a coach, as a teacher, as an athlete yourself, whatever you may be doing in the years that follow. But I would really urge you to be thinking about, rather than doing the norm, it is the norm, of either work to rest ratios, which is still time, which is good to some extent, or repetitions. There's still too much variation in there in terms of the tempo of the motion and the duration of the motion for which the motion occurs with time under tension. So, and really the whole premise of actually determining repetitions and work to rest ratios is based on time. It's based on time. And that's not rocket science. And I think when we think about it, that makes perfect sense. That's the case. Someone somewhere decided it was easier just to count some reps. And so it's become the norm. And if done properly with the right tempo, then you'll get the right time under tension. But why even do that? Why not just go for the proper duration of time, recognizing at a given load for a certain time you're going for, you're going to have to find the right load, the right resistance to get the benefit of the time to maximize hypertrophy. Okay. Intensity, we talk about percent-wise, hypertrophy is typically probably somewhere in the range of 70-75% force output to probably as high as about 85-90% force output. 90% is a little bit on the high range, but could be for some people. Okay, so it's kind of 70-90% force output, give or take in there. I would never fault you if you're off by 5%, even 10%. Questionable, not terribly far off there. More than 10%, more than 5 or 10% difference there. There's going to be some question there for as too much variability. Okay, not right or wrong, but something to think about. And then rest periods. Rest between for hypertrophy, being we're looking at type 2A fiber, predominant growth, mostly glycolytic type work, some on the tail end of creatine phosphate potentially, some at the very early range of starting to become more aerobic to some extent, but very much glycolytic. We're looking at rest periods. The longer your work period, up to about 75 seconds, then the rest period should probably be shorter because you didn't use as much ATP to be able to handle such force production for a longer period to be able to maintain it. So consequently, rest periods can be shorter in the range of closer to a minute. Okay, you could possibly argue maybe longer than that. I'm sorry, closer to a minute. So if you work for 75 seconds, I'd probably look at rest periods about 60 seconds, give or take. You can rest longer. With that said, probably about appropriate there. And then work periods are closer to 40 seconds, and rest periods should be closer to about 90 seconds. From a hypertrophy's perspective, there is no question that 60 to 90 seconds rest period seems to be the most applicable. Okay. And then as far as how often we do it, again, 48 to 72 hours. Maximal strength and maximal power, they're so closely related in terms of their work periods are unquestionably ideally 10 seconds or less. Can you go longer than that? Absolutely. It just won't be 95+% force output. It just won't. It can't be. It's not possible. Remember the analogy of jumping up and down. Jump as high as you possibly can right now. Warm up properly, of course, do all that, but jump as high as you possibly can. I don't care how hard you try. You will lose force production. You won't be able to jump as high after a few seconds. It'll dwindle from there quite substantially over the course of the next minute. As you drop, you're looking at about maximal 95-100% force output for 10 seconds or less. You might be, for freaks of nature, able to maintain about 90-95% force output to 30+ seconds, but there's no question about it, unless we're talking about an absolute freak, you're looking at dropping down about 80-85% force output or less by about 90 seconds. And then by the time you get to 2 minutes and beyond, now we're looking at about 75% force output or so. Granted, these are numbers that are generalized, and it's going to depend very much on the person. It's a great thing to be able to assess and check out for yourself, to be able to go and do some maximal work and do some more glycolate type work and look at your own numbers. And you can see some pretty strong resemblances here to these ranges, not exact numbers. Okay. And so as far as work period, time or attention, 10 seconds or less maximum ideally. Can you go longer? Yes, but that's ATP-CP, right? And that is antiphosphate, creatine phosphate. The intensity is 90 to 100% force output, probably 95 to 100% force output, generally speaking, quite high for maximal strength, maximal power, right? Rest periods, maximal rest, 3 to 5 minutes. Why? The largest number of people tend to need 3 to 5 minutes to get 100% ATP replenishment back. Elite athletes can get it back in 90 seconds. And there you go. A frequency for maximal power, maximal strength every 3 to 4 days. Okay. Freaks can go more often, in a good way freaks, and less freakish, less often. So, cardiovascular disease and physical activity, and to cover this very briefly, I'm not going to go into the intricate details of every single variety of cardiovascular disease. We're going to talk in general about a couple, and activity requirements, which we've talked about before, that should seem pretty familiar, along with risk factors. As of 2006, 17% of all deaths were related to coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease, coronary heart disease, same thing. It was 50% in 1970. And that decline, so a positive decline, like 2/3 the number of people are not as prevalent to getting heart attacks or from coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease, possibly due to improved awareness of risk factors, which we'll talk about. We've talked about already last chapter. Lifestyle changes, eating better, more exercise, getting better sleep, having less stress in your life in general, better and earlier diagnosis. Remember, we talked about the frequency of going and get medical checkups, and greater CPR skill prevalence, people being CPR certified, very important, right? And of course, on top of that, secondary benefits, or I should say more specific to people who already had a heart attack or stroke or some sort of form of heart failure. The patient risk is reduced due also to improved drugs. The benefit of a lot of drugs have gotten better. And of course, surgical procedures have also improved. Hopefully we never get to the point where I have to worry about that. I'm one of those people who doesn't like to take drugs. I don't want to take drugs for anything if I can help it. But like all things, at the end of the day, there comes a point where having a little help is a good thing. But certainly we want to be taking into account all the controllable factors that don't relate to prescription drugs if we can. That's between us and our doctor, right? Exercising for as little as 2 minutes may decrease incidence of heart attacks by 50% over the next 24 hours. That is a rule, or a guideline for people who don't like to exercise. I don't like to exercise. I don't do much. I do my gardening. Okay, no. 2 minutes cardiovascular exercise, actually continuous. Go out the door, walk down several houses, come back. You're kidding me. No, not kidding you, right? That research is very strong and it's hugely important, but it only protects you for 24 hours, right? So you got to do it again tomorrow, right? Coronary heart disease, aka coronary artery disease. Atherosclerosis is a form of arteriosclerosis. I used to confuse the two. I don't know what that was all about. Arteriosclerosis is a body of many different potential diseases and illness, diseases specifically. Atherosclerosis is one aspect of that. And it's progressive narrowing of the arteries due to formation of fatty plaque. And that progressive narrowing of those arteries specifically is also related to coronary heart disease or coronary artery disease in the narrowing of the coronary arteries. Okay. And that said, as the narrowing increases, the myocardium of the heart muscle can't receive sufficient blood, right? Lacking oxygen and nutrients, and therefore causing something called ischemia, which is, and that's basically typical chest pain known as angina pectoris. Okay, ischemia is lacking sufficient blood. Okay, and that typical chest pain is what people mostly get, but some people get random, different like shoulder pain, things that have nothing to do with just the chest. Ischemia can lead to a heart attack, a myocardial infarction, MI, due to deprivation of oxygen to the cells of the heart, leading to irreversible damage and cell death or necrosis. That's cell death. Tissues in general becomes more necrotic when you don't use it. Okay, that's true of muscle, skeletal muscle, as well as cardiac muscle, both. It's also true of connective tissue. All tissue becomes more necrotic when it's not used properly and it doesn't maintain its normal elasticity, and that's not a good thing. Hypertension, when blood pressure is essentially 140 or higher for the systolic or 90 or higher for the diastolic, neither of which is a good thing. That's high blood pressure. Pre-hypertensive is 120 to 140 for the systolic and basically 80 to 90 for the diastolic, neither one of which is good. And 32% of American adults are believed to be hypertensive. And the book notes that can eventually cause the heart to enlarge, often related to body size, and arterioles to become less elastic. And that isn't just related to body size, though. Stress itself can do that. Strokes are forms of cardiovascular disease affecting the cerebral arteries, so affecting blood supply to the brain, typically resulting in paralysis. There's two different forms, and either way, it still results in paralysis, either left or right side, vision or speech problems, depending on which side of the stroke has occurred of the brain. Behavioral change, which either means to slow to respond or overly fast. It's interesting. Various depending on which side of the brain, and memory loss, either way, none of which being a good thing. Heart failure essentially is a chronic and progressive weakening of the heart, limiting cardiac output, right? Stroke volume goes down, left ventricular wall thickness and left ventricular size will decrease over time due to lack of disuse, atrophy, not good. The arteries become more constricted. They don't have that same elasticity either. None of that is good. Hypertension typically precedes this heart failure in 75% of cases. Okay. Now plaque, which is what lines the walls and actually leads to potentially heart issues and blockage of arteries, coronary artery in particular, is composed of smooth muscle cells, connective tissue, inflammatory cells, and debris that forms at the site, basically of that chronic stress. And that's it. That's where it's supposed to end, and I got a little blip of my last slide over the top there. But it forms the site of the injury, and where it forms that site of the injury, low-density lipoproteins are attracted and deposited to the plaque over time, with increase being exacerbated by free radicals from cigarette smoking and infectious microorganisms. Illnesses in general can lead to adding more plaque. Of course, poor eating habits and lack of physical activity can cause more of this buildup over time. And this plaque can rupture and lead to a thrombus or a clot, which accounts for 70% of myocardial infarctions, MIs, and cardiac arrests. Now, coronary heart disease factors we can't control. Heredity or family history of coronary heart disease. We talked about whether you're male, someone in your family below 55, or female, someone in your family below 65, that's a risk. Your race, your gender, and advanced age, can't control those things. Men are more likely to have heart attacks, and of course, by age, by 10 years earlier than women. Factors we can control, which is our final point here, smoking. Cessation is most important. Cardiovascular activity is the most prevalent in reducing the effects. If somebody does smoke, they smoke at all, they're a smoker. Okay, blood pressure, reducing hypertension, decreased at least 6 to 7 millimeters mercury with regular cardiovascular exercise. At least. I know I for one, right after my honeymoon, I went to see a doctor, and doctor is a doctor never saw again afterward because I didn't like his demeanor and the way he talked to me. Like all of a sudden I was someone who needed heart surgery or something. He basically said, "You need to lose the belly, and or I'll put you on medication." And like just didn't even look at me. Wouldn't even look at me when he said it. Very nonchalant, didn't care. And I stopped going to that doctor. Didn't mean it was wrong. It was just concerning. But that said, my blood pressure was 140/90 at that time. First time I've ever measured high in a medical setting. Within 2 months of regular cardiovascular exercise, I was at 115/75. Not true for everybody, but I got after it every single day. And this, you can get your blood pressure change much more than this, depending upon some of your things you can't control, right? As well as the regularity of your activity. Frequency matters most, right? Not just intensity. Over time, for longer duration, longer intensities or greater intensities matter for overall elite type conditioning. But in the beginning, just getting healthy, frequency matters most. Cholesterol and triglycerides, cardiovascular activity dramatically increases HDL, the high density lipoproteins, the artery clearing basically cholesterol, whereas the LDL is artery clogging cholesterol, but it's really the very low density lipoproteins. People talk about VLDL, that's really the greater issue, not just LDL, in creating issues for potential heart problems. And of course, lowering triglycerides with regular activity cardiovascularly as well. Level of physical activity, minimum of 150 minutes of moderate exercise weekly, preferably 20 to 60 minutes, at least 3 to 5 days per week, right? Perfect world, every day. Cannot deny how important that would be. The benefits are increased left ventricular size and wall thickness. We talked about these things before. Increased stroke volume, increased heart contractility and elasticity, increased arterial size and elasticity, increased plasma volume with greater heme, basically greater oxygen capacity, greater red blood cell content. All positive things. From the cardiovascular exercise, can you get cardiovascular benefit from strength type training? Yes, but you have to be focusing on strength endurance and some hypertrophy. You're not going to get much from maximal strength type training. Okay. Weight. We talked about BMI being below 30, preferably below even 25. By itself, in itself, not a factor, but you combine it with these other concerns, it's a major factor. And lastly, blood glucose levels, avoiding hyper or hypoglycemia, by creating potential for reducing insulin resistance. We want insulin sensitivity. We don't want insulin resistance. Regular activity will stimulate better hormonal response, less cholesterol, better hormonal balance as a whole, and obviously with the same factors we just mentioned before in terms of circulation as a whole, it's going to dramatically improve insulin sensitivity and a lesser need for insulin to be increased at such a high rate during times of stress. Okay. So final thoughts. Expect the email later today noting whose paper you'll review and who will be reviewing yours. Respond to that email with the rough draft that you're going to need to get reviewed. So just send it to me and the other student. So there's the email. And then when you complete it, you've edited someone's rough draft. You're going to submit that via Blackboard. There'll be a notation for a rough draft, and that's where you want to submit that. And then your final paper will also be due in Blackboard by May 1st. More on that to come in email. Again, hope all is well. One more lecture video, perhaps two at the very, very most. Hope you're doing well. Keep in touch as you need to. We'll talk to you soon.